In the last weeks, in my strength sessions in the gym, it was kind of, it almost seems that it is kind of random. Whether I do have a good day and I can get back to my normal weights, or I do have a bad day and I have to reduce the weights I use, given the sets are set and given also the reps are to some extent set. So today I again had to reduce the weight I used. And this was mostly probably to systemic fatigue. Now, this means that my sleep quality was maybe not high enough. Maybe my sleep was also not long enough, but since I have standardized the amount of sleep, to some extent at least, with now little or less variance than before, this now is something that I cannot influence that much any longer because I already have somewhat standardized it. So this means that I have other things that I now can control, such as I yesterday, for example, ate a little bit differently, which then led to me eating about half an hour later, which then basically cut into my fasting before sleep. So I try to get at least 2 hours of fasting, or not eating rather, before sleep. And this then seems to negatively have impacted my ability to fall asleep, but also probably then my sleep quality. In addition, I forgot to put one window on incline, which then led to me also being not cooled that much, and I thought it was on incline, so I usually have 2 windows on incline, which then leads to somewhat airflow, because I lie in between those windows. The airflow goes from one window to the other, and of course this also means that it's noisier, especially since I'm living in a city and there are cars driving by, sometimes also sirens going off and on. But I have noticed that if I am able to cool myself and I am able to sleep cooler, this seems to positively impact my sleep scores at least, which to some extent probably correlate also with sleep quality, even though they might be slightly different vectors, so to speak. Now, again, back to the gym today and back to also the last weeks. So once I began taking creatine in the last year, my strength, at least over the period of a couple of months, went a little bit up. And it went up somewhat unexpectedly, or more than I would have expected if I didn't take creatine. So this seems to be at least somewhat caused. This seems to have been somewhat caused by creatine at least. And so I then had to take creatine not for a certain amount of time due to a medical reason, and then I began taking creatine again, but till now I have not been able to go back basically to progressing, and also not back to also my records. Now sometimes I do hit records, sometimes I do have a really good day. Now what I noticed is that sometimes I allow myself to basically sleep a little bit longer, because I already know that, for example, if I'm not able to go to bed 2 hours, if I go to bed late and 2 hours too late, then I have to sleep in, because otherwise my sleep and also my other metrics seem to be too negatively impacted, or rather, then there seems to be a net positive of sleeping the additional 2 hours, which are not additional, but just the standard 8 hours I try to get, and try to still get them. Now, this also then disrupts my circadian rhythm again for the whole week, so it makes it harder to stand up in the next day, on the next day, and on the next day, and until it basically comes a little bit back to baseline, where I do wake up a few minutes before the alarm. I then might change it again because there might be something else that's happening. And so what I'm trying to say here is, as long as I am not able to constrain these different variables, such as, okay, I do have a day where I don't go exactly to bed on time. And not only not exactly to bed on time, but I go to bed 1 hour later. There seems also to be an effect where if I don't hit my bedtime at the specified time within 5 or 10 minutes, then my alertness begins to increase again until it drops off again. Now, this means that by choosing basically to then go bed 2 hours later, I am basically maybe choosing the better thing. But I also noticed, at least in my data, the last week and the last 2 weeks, that once I did go bed at midnight then, instead of 10, my sleep did basically not have the normal quality it otherwise would have had, in addition to now having the negative impact on my circadian rhythm for the at least couple of next days. But my circadian rhythm, I noticed over the last years now, seems to be quite sensitive. And this comes back to kind of performing in the gym. If I do want to progress in the gym right now, and I think I do have to progress in the gym, and the same is true for my cardiovascular training. So if you just separate training into strength training and cardiovascular training, and also include sprint training or interval training or VO2 max training in this cardiovascular thing. Now, one could also say it is just basically strength training, so muscle training just for the heart. And that might be one way to think about this. So it's basically strength training, but in order to hit the heart and to make the heart basically a more potent muscle, you have to do something else compared to lifting weights, which is to fatigue the system, such that the heart then has to pump more. Now, if I think about this, and I think about basically my next decades possibly, then I probably have the responsibility, at least in my eyes, to try to get basically my potency or my system, which in terms of cardiovascular or in terms of strength might be basically strength or cardiovascular, then I do have the responsibility to try to drive them up as high as I can, because they eventually will already decline. And they already, I think, decline. My skin, for example, already began to deteriorate, even though that might not be noticeable. I do not look like I'm 18 any longer because of multiple things that have been kind of appearing on my skin, also known as wrinkles. So back to the gym. As long as I am not sure what caused something, and I can only guess. So this might be because I ate 30 minutes later yesterday, and this seems to be the main cause. But this also might be because I left one window not open, so I basically only had one window open. This also might be because I actually worked till 10, because I did not have that much else to do. So by working till 10, I basically had my brain still to some extent alert. So I worked for the last 20 or 30 minutes because I just did this. And so I also went to bed 10 minutes later. And this is also something I already noticed in school. So basically anywhere from 12 to 14, 15, 16. If I already tried to go to bed on exactly 10 p.m. in school, and I usually got up kind of similar to now, which is also partially the reason why I got back to this system, because if it worked as basically a young adult, where basically in my best health, at least in theory, then why would it not work right now? And if I try to, maybe similar to Brian Johnson, get back to a state that is closer basically to the ideal in terms of age state, then maybe adopting a sleep schedule that worked already during this age or during puberty might be something that's very useful. So in the later end of my puberty, I basically try to already go to bed on the exact minute, as close as I could possibly get this. Now, this often meant that I went to bed 5 minutes later, for example, 10 minutes later. What I noticed is that if there is a deviation that is more than 5 minutes, let's say, then I notice on the next day that there is a negative impact. This could be that my runs are slower. This could be that in school I didn't perform that much or that well. This could be that my brain just doesn't work as well. This could be that mostly, and this is the main effect I usually noticed, is that on the next day, once the clock or the alarm hit, I just was not as ready. And similar, so the 5 minutes, so it basically seems like this. Sleep is kind of like a washing program, at least in my view. And the washing program has a certain duration. Now, you can teach your body, to a certain extent at least, provided this evidence provided by anecdotal stories over the last years I collected basically on my own, not on my own but on myself. Now, if this washing program has a certain duration, and it also has to do its job. Now, it can adapt basically its duration slightly. Now, I also tried to sleep for 4 hours for a couple of years, and maybe also nap during the day, and maybe then also sleep during the day an additional 2 hours. I had various systems I tried. Now, it seems to be the case that if you are very precise about hitting your exact sleep times, that the body adapts to it. Even if I go to bed at midnight and then wake up at 4. Now, for a couple of nights, this might actually work. So I tried actually sleeping for a couple of nights for just 4 hours and not sleeping through the entirety of the day. Now, this didn't work in the long term. Disclaimer here. And also, I reverted back to 8 hours, which is, at least in hindsight, seems to make more sense. Now, what I noticed is that basically if I did not hit my sleep time even by 5 minutes, then I was already off. Now, 10 minutes, I was off more. And half an hour to 40 minutes, so sometimes I had basically an additional training I did on one day of the week that was going into the evening, that basically ended at 10. And so I couldn't make my bedtime. And this is basically also, as I'm thinking of this, I also noticed that during this time, where I often went to this training, my school performance in some subjects at least also seemed to have been dropping off a little bit compared to before, where this was not so much the case. So basically I slept less and less and less as a younger adult. What I'm trying to say here is that explaining or trying to explain why last night or why my performance in the gym today was not as good as it could have been. And this have been not like some random sessions, but 1 out of 3 or 2 out of 3 gym sessions in the last weeks have been kind of off, and I've had to reduce the weight I was able to use prior. And now I also am taking creatine again, and I did hit a few more peaks in the last weeks compared to the last weeks before, where it just dropped and dropped and dropped mostly. And also, whenever I do allow my body to sleep a little bit longer, then this one night of sleep seems to positively impact my performance on this day. But during even a week, my circadian rhythm seems to be then more and more synchronized. Because if I sleep a little bit longer, then I cannot sleep usually at night. And if I sleep 2 hours longer, then my circadian rhythm seems to almost be basically prolonged, not prolonged, but postponed by 2 hours, which means that I then would again go to bed at midnight. And so the circle, it repeats itself again and again and again. And as long as I am not able to constrain all of these different variables, as long as I do not have data that is measured again and again, and I try to introduce many different points or many different data points, such as, okay, I do work out the exact same workout every single day at the gym, or 3 times a week in terms of the strength training, and then I do 1 interval training, and I do something else, and so on and so forth, and I try to basically standardize, such that I then could cross-compare the weeks by 1 week from another, where even if lots of variables are happening, at least the data that is recorded, which is my sets and my reps, and my weight I use for these sets in terms of strength training, for example, are at least somewhat standardized, and I then can draw conclusions from this.